Hey there, y'all. Dr. Dan back. Man, it's been fun to spend some time with y'all, and I'm sure we'll get to questions and answers, but we're going to talk about receiving calf nutrition. And so I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to talk about what we do when we feed these calves and getting them started. And so, when these calves are being abruptly weaned or they're coming in, their rumens aren't functioning yet. We could have mineral deficiencies. We could have vitamin deficiencies. We could have, but at the end of the day, the real importance is to get these calves to eat. And cattle that don't eat get sick, and cattle that are sick don't eat. And so, starting the calves at the beginning of the day is just so important. But the number one, next to oxygen, the number one nutrient is water. And cattle will drink 3 times their dry matter intake in the fall, winter, and spring, and they drink 5 times their dry matter intake in the summer. And so there's a lot of times when we're feeding high sulfur diets or feeding some byproduct feeds, we don't have any problems. But all of a sudden we get to the summer and we start to see some issues. And it might be that that's when we start to uncover that we have some issues with our water source. If you have problems at an operation in the summer, but you aren't seeing it in the fall or the spring or the winter, you might want to start to check the water and make sure, because we will see this increase in water intake. So how do you identify problems with water source? The first thing is if cattle aren't eating, there's a problem with the water. Another one is if you have cattle huddled around the water source, there could be problems with water pressure and water flow rate, or it might be off together. At any rate, when cattle are huddled around it, there may be a bully animal there taking the evaporative cooling off the water, but for the most part, there might be something with your water flow. Some of the problems I've seen with water tanks is too tall of water tank for too small a cattle. You can't lower the water tank, so you can build the ground up around the water tank so that smaller cattle can get a drink. Newly received calves sometimes don't know what a water tank is, and some of the things that we'll do to use the sense of smell, the sense of sight, and the sense of hearing is we may leave the pitcock on so that the cattle can hear water running, or I might pop the plug and wash the water tank out and make kind of a mud hole in front of the water tank if the conditions are dry, so the cattle see that. They also can smell it, and so it'll help cattle identify the water source. There may not be enough pressure. A lot of times in western Kansas, West Texas, we have to put a water tank above ground so we have water pressure higher enough for our feed yard. Linear water tank space, I don't think we've identified yet what our water tank space needs to be, but I think that's some research that needs to be done. And most of our water tanks now are energy free, so stray voltage really isn't an issue. But when I start to think about water tank space and the ability, the one up here in the upper left-hand corner is really good for West Texas and Arizona. Water's bubbling, it's staying fresh, it's aerated. But boy, that thing would freeze over in Iowa or South Dakota. These ball water tanks, they can be pretty good, but you have to train the animals first. And you have to push that tank down or the ball down and block it off with a bolt so that the animals get used to drinking out of the holes. I've seen 2 salt toxicosis cases in starter yards or in feed yards, and both of them were people had salt and trace mineral out for calves, and they were going to the salt, and they had these ball water tanks, and the calves didn't know the water was underneath, so they weren't drinking. And then once they figured out that sodium in the brain and that salt toxicity would cause the swelling and cause some issues. I put this one in the bottom left down. If you want cattle to not defecate or deposit manure in the water tank, one thing you can do is put a crap step around your water tank. And that is a 4-inch by 4-inch concrete lip. I don't think cattle intentionally crap in the water tank. I don't think they get a drink and say, I'll show you, Bob, and do that. I think they do it by accident. And if we have a crap step where they back up and they stop, they deposit down the side between themselves and the water tank, and it can save you some issues with cleaning water tanks and improving water quality for cattle. So we'll talk about stress and the requirement. And I love the history of ruminant nutrition. And generally speaking, cattle do not have, if I have two calves standing here that are of the same size and same stature, they have, and one of them's stressed and one of them's not stressed, they both have the same nutrient requirements. Okay, they have the same vitamin E requirements, they have the same protein requirements, the same zinc requirements, the same energy requirements. The difference is the one that is stressed will have lower feed intake. So the requirements aren't different of these two calves, but due to decreased intake, to get the proper number of nutrients to the animal that's stressed, I have to concentrate those nutrients in the starting diet to fortify that animal. So we'll talk a little bit about this. One of the things I think is important for you to understand if there's a problem in the cattle, if cattle aren't eating 1.5% of their body weight by a week and a half on feed, and this was done by Dr. Todd Milton on millions of head of cattle, we have a problem. So 1.5% of body weight, dry matter intake by a week and a half on feed. If they're not, and this goes back to correlating with Dave Hutchison's work and Andy Cole, back when you looked at the cattle that were sick on the pinpointers were eating about 1.5% of their body weight versus the ones that weren't sick were eating 2% of their body weight. You can see that we can use dry matter intake as a sensitive measure as to understanding the sickness rate that's going on within a pen of calves. So when we're going to put, if we have big rocks, little rocks, and sand, and we want to put them into a jar, the first things that you put in are the big rocks into the jar, then you put the littler rocks into the jar, and then you put the sand to fill in around the cracks. If I'd filled the jar halfway up with sand and then try to put the rocks in, it just doesn't work. Well, the big rocks to receiving calf nutrition are protein and energy. The little rocks, or the icing on the cake, are vitamins, minerals, and things to that nature. In the NRC, they say we need to feed at least 12.5% crude protein to receiving calves, which really hasn't been a problem because of all the byproduct feeds being 30% crude protein. But now, as we start to see a decrease in some of the availability of byproducts, we're coming back to understanding the crude protein needs. Based on Gallien's research, based on Lofgren's research and Hutchison's research, optimum performance and decreased morbidity in newly received high-risk calves is achieved at about 14% crude protein. So 12.5 is the lowest we want to go. 14% is the optimal level of crude protein in these receiving diets. Now, when we look at natural protein sources versus non-protein nitrogen, when you look at Tom X research and other research that has been done by Preston, myself, looking at this, we really want to make sure that we're going to have a natural source of crude protein, meaning we want increased bypass protein. So when we start to feed corn gluten meal, when we're feeding feather meal that has 90% bypass, when we're feeding soybean meal, cottonseed meal that has 50% bypass protein, those are the types of crude protein that these calves in this receiving ration are going to do better. You can supplement some urea in there, but the urea rule is never feed more than 1% of diet dry matter as urea. The only time you can feed more urea is when you get into some of these really 94% concentrate finish rations or 90% concentrate finish rations. But at the end of the day, remember this: these calves are coming in without a functioning rumen. We cannot solubilize urea and utilize it until we have a functioning rumen. And so using a natural source, a bypass protein source, work with your nutritionist is vitally important. I love soybean meal. I love cottonseed meal, and using in these receiving diets. Remember, corn, 65% of corn's crude protein is a bypass protein. So we're really talking about those supplemental protein sources. Wanting to make sure 14% crude protein coming from a natural protein source. We're going to limit the use of non-protein nitrogen in that first ration, and we're looking for some bypass to help get these calves kick-started. The goal of energy is getting them to eat, and I will use a high-quality cereal hay, and I will top dress that with my milled ration. So if I'm going to go to a TMR or a mixed ration, what I'll do is I'll put some hay in the bunk, and I'll top dress that with my milled ration, just to help the calves find the bunk, fluff that hay up, and it's something that they're used to, something that is familiar to them. How long do I feed hay to calves? I can tell you that feeding hay is so important. Lofgren's work that showed almost double the intake and double the performance when we offer ad libitum hay to these newly received calves versus just feeding them a milled ration. It's messy and it's hard to do, and that's the reason why people don't do it. But if you're worried about the starting these calves, if you feed hay until they get to cleaning it up in 2, 3, 4 days, then what we'll see is improved health, improved gut health, and you get these calves started, and you'll decrease the morbidity, improve the feed intake, and improve the performance. After, and I'll top dress that one ration on top. After they've cleaned up the hay for a couple of days, then I just go to my milled ration, the starter ration, and we're off and running. If you have bunk broke cattle or low risk cattle that come in and they're aggressive to the bunk, don't worry about the hay on those calves. Just get them started on a milled ration after a day of hay, and and you're off to the races. This is a group of calves that came in. This is the way I like to feed hay to these newly received calves. Cattle crave hay. They crave roughage, and they understand. And this is some wheat hay that we had baled off some circles in southwest Kansas. But when I have cattle that are consuming, these cattle are pretty aggressive. I'd probably switch them the next day when I see them up there eating the hay like this. But just to get them off to a good start and get them rolling, hay is so important. These hay processors are lifesavers. If you have a bunch of cattle or you have the ability to use these to put out hay, if you don't have a hay processor, you're putting hay out by hand by busting little bales, and we've all done that off the back of flatbed pickups. And so it decreases the messiness of feeding hay, and it decreases the labor of feeding hay. This is what I mean by top dressing the hay with my one ration or my total mixed ration, just to get those calves acclimated to that first diet that we're gonna give them. And then after a couple of days of this and they're cleaning up, I'm going to switch them just over to that one ration. Some people will question whether or not you should feed high moisture silage to these calves, and I'll just tell you this, that when Fluharty and Lurch's work showed that if you feed silage, you may have some decrease in intake or gains during the first 2 weeks. But at the end of a 28-day period, there's no decrease in performance. So I have no problem starting calves on silage or with silage in the ration or distiller's grains at all. We want to have our receiving diets anywhere from 55 to 65% concentrate. Concentrates would be corn, protein supplement, vitamin, mineral, fat. Roughages would be your hays, and whether it's alfalfa hay, cereal grass hay, gin trash, cottonseed burrs, things to that nature. Silage is our tweener, okay? Silage, I consider that to be 50% roughage, 50% concentrate. So in that one ration, or that starter ration, if we're going to be at 60% or 65% concentrate, I'm going to use silage as a 50% both ways, and then use the others to make up the balance as we move forward. Other important nutrients, we want to go at 4 times based on Clint Crable's work, Dave Sechrist's work. We want to go at 4 times the international units per day of vitamin E. Potassium can be used at 1% in the starter ration to help with rehydration. And then micro minerals are becoming more and more of a topic. And my number one way to feed minerals is in the bunk. And make sure you have proper selenium, zinc, copper, manganese. But if I'm going to do it at the chute, I'd rather do it as a drench than with some of the EDTA-based injectable minerals. As more and more information is going to come out, I think we're going to know more and more about the advantage of using a drench versus using injectable minerals, especially when it comes to maybe some of the toxicities that you can create with some of the injectable minerals due to EDTA being the carrier. Mixing feed is really, really important when you start to think about, grandma, who bakes the best cookies, and that's grandma's, right? Because grandma knows which ingredients need to go in the truck or need to go into the mixer wagon to make sure that all the ingredients are evenly dispersed. And when we're talking about vitamins, minerals, hay, roughage, fat, feed additives, making sure that we have the best mix possible. And so if I had corn, distillers, hay, and silage as my 4 ingredients, the way that I would load that mixer wagon is I would put my corn and distillers in first, and I would let that mix. And while that's mixing, I would be going to get my hay, and I would put the hay in on top of after I got the trace minerals, the corn, I would put my premix in there too, but my premix, my distillers, my corn, and get that good and mixed into a bigger and bigger bunch within there. Then I put the hay on top, and I put the silage on top of the hay because it's wet and heavy, and it would push it down into the teeth of the mixer. But for the best mix, that's the right way to do it. Corn, distillers, my vitamin and trace mineral premix in there. Then I put my hay on top of it, followed by that silage to hold it down and mix it. Vitally important, not only the timing, but the way that you put those ingredients in to improve the mixing capacity and the efficiency and the thoroughness of the mix as you're going to deliver it to that bunk. The best way to test your mixing is go out and deliver the feed to the bunk and go take 5 samples from one end of the bunk to the other. And the consistency of the roughage to concentrate, if you want to use a Penn State shaker box, should be the same all the way along that bunk. You can turn in those 5 samples for chemical analysis or feed additive analysis like rumen or Thomson. It should be the same level across all those spots that you sample. But one of the things we're doing a lot more and more of is going through with that Penn State shaker box and looking to see if my roughage to concentrate and the evenness across that feed bunk is consistent. They've been doing it in dairies for years, and we're starting to do it in feedlots as well. Bunk management. Bunk management is crucial, for transitioning animals from no concentrate or from milk and grass to a finish ration, which can be 95% concentrate. It's also important for bunk management not only to transfer these animals from a concentrate-based diet or roughage-based diet to a concentration-based diet, but it's also equally important that we don't have feed wastage. So we're managing the cattle to consume all the feed that we put in the bunk while we're trying to adjust their rumen to make sure we don't have acidosis, that we don't wind up with laminitis, and that we don't have death due to too much concentrate. So when we start to think about stepping up, again, the typical starter ration or that one ration is going to be 55 to 65% concentrate. From that point forward, a conventional cattle feeding step-up system is to go at 10% increments about 7 to 10 days apart. So if I start out at 65% concentrate In my 1 ration, my 2 ration is going to be 75% concentrate. My 3 ration is going to be 85%. And then my 4 ration or my finisher ration is 92%. So that starter ration, and what we do as a general rule of thumb, is I will leave calves on that starter ration or that 1 ration until their health is cleaned up. Meaning that if I'm having a BRD spike, I'm going to leave them on the 1 ration until we get out there and we are sure that the morbidity episode is over. And the reason is decreased intakes, increased stress. So if I have these decreased intakes, my 1 ration is the one that has more vitamin E. It has more selenium. It has more of the trace minerals. It's more fortified because we know that cattle have decreased intakes due to stress. So the other thing is if I have cattle going to the hospital pen and they're staying there and I make a ration change, those animals may be in the hospital pen for 7 to 10 days. I bring them back. The other cattle have been acclimated and not only had 1 ration change, maybe had 2 while that calf was in the hospital pen. So if I can leave those animals on that starter ration, maybe up to 45 days before I start switching them to that 2 ration, to 3 ration, to 4 ration, I have seen better health, improved health, decreased morbidity. And the nutritionists I work with, they usually say, I'm going to give you the first 30 to 40 days. But after that, and you get them healed up and they're fine, then it's going to be my turn to get them stepped up on to finish ration and take them home. And so once we go off of that, so my question is, most people say, well, when do I go off the 1 ration? My answer to that is once the health is straightened out within the pen. Once the health is straightened out in the pen, now it's kind of programmed, 5 to 7 days. If they're cleaning up, 7 days after I switch them to the 2 ration, I'm going to the 3 ration. And after the 3 ration, I'm going to the 4 ration. And then they'll stay on that 4 ration the rest of the feeding period. And one of the things that's kind of cool or natural is that if I stop feeding a bovine, it takes 5 to 7 days before that rumen will become empty. That's by design. The animals can go out, they can graze, they can fill up their rumen. A storm can come in, they can take shelter out on the prairie, and they can continuously ruminate and have nutrients for that 5 to 7 days. And so when you start to think about changing rations every 5 to 7 days, that's the same amount of time in the physiological change of total rumen turnover from 1 ration to the next, as we step them up from a 65% concentrate to 92% concentrate. It's just so important. This is an example of some yearlings that came in. They weren't on hay. They came in and they're on the 1 ration here with the blue line. And you can see that we gave them 10 pounds of dry matter the first day. They cleaned it up. We gave them 15 the next day. We gave them 19 the next day. And you can see that they were consuming rations. So these were healthy animals. If these were high-risk calves, that might have been out there 20, 30 days before they start consuming. But anyway, I got them on this 1 ration. They're consuming. So 5 days later, I move them to the 2 ration with the yellow bar. And you can see they're cleaning that up for 6 days. Then I switch them to the 3 ration. And they consume that for 5 days, and then we just kick them on to the finisher. But I can get a yearling or a calf that's bunk broke. I don't have to feed them hay up front. I can put them right on the 1 ration. I can make some pretty big jumps in feed intake on that lower concentrate ration, get to where they're going to eat, and then start to make my systematic adjustments thereafter, about 5 to 7 days, getting them to that 4 ration. On average, if someone says, how much are these cattle eating? If you just guess 20 pounds of dry matter a day across the feed yard, you'd be pretty close. So as you can see, as we get up to that 25 or 26 pounds of dry matter on the finish ration, for the most part, cattle are going to consume, 20, 25 pounds of dry matter. Lighter weight calves, not so much. Bunk management. The reason why we want to be consistent is we want to decrease feed wastage. As we have these higher moisture rations and we get into places with higher amount of rainfall, we generally have to scoop bunks more, and we have to do a better job of making sure we don't get mold in those feeds and mold in our bunks. So providing that fresh ration to those newly received calves to get them to eat is vitally important. So we want to manage these bunks to a slick bunk so that we manage our natural resources, that we make those calves consume it, but it also decreases the amount of problems that we have in the bunk when we're feeding them. I get some of these questions quite a bit. How many times a day should I feed? It doesn't matter. If you can feed once a day and get all the feed out and it doesn't spoil, feed once a day. It really comes down to, do I have the bunk space, the bunk volume, and what's the volume of the ration? But depending on how much bunk space is available, I may not be able to put all the feed required for that pen in the bunk at once. And if I do, it may be a 100-degree day with high moisture feeds that's going to get moldy in the bottom. So managing the feed quality in the bunk, managing the ability to fit all the feed in the bunk is what, I see people who feed once a day, people who feed twice a day, and people who feed 3 times a day. And they wind up with the same amount of performance and feed efficiency. It really gets down to working with your nutritionist and designing the system for you. What time of day should I feed? That doesn't matter either. It's just cattle are creatures of habit, and they don't wear watches. So if you're going to feed, make sure you feed the same time of the day based on the juxtaposition of the sun so that cattle get into a routine. It's amazing to me that cattle can watch 5 feed trucks go by and know that that's not their feed that's going to be delivered. But when it comes the 6th time, they start to stand up and go to the bunk. They're creatures of habit. They're watching the moves that we make. And so we have to make sure that we feed these animals at the same time of the day. One of the times we get into trouble with bloat is in the spring. And it's not just because of the wind and the weather and causing cattle to ball up, but also we have daylight savings time. And again, I mentioned that cattle don't have watches. So before daylight savings time, before we spring forward, a month before then, what we'll start to do is every week incrementally change our feeding time by 15 minutes so that when we hit daylight savings time, the workers and the cattle are acclimated to the change in time, and we just get to moving on. So there are 3 different things that we read when it comes to bunk management. You're going to read the bunks, you're going to read the cattle, and you're going to read the feces. And I can always tell people when they take my classes that you may not know a lot of things when you get done, but if someone comes up to you and says you don't know shit, you can say, pardon me, sir, you can say that I'm not very smart, but I took Dr. Dan's nutrition class and I do know shit. And pardon my French for this. But anyway, with bunk management, when you read the bunk, there are basically 4 different levels that we measure. Either it's more than 10% of yesterday's offering, a dusting, slick, or double slick. Slick means no feed in the bunk. Double slick means not only is the feed gone, but the bunk is wet from the cattle licking the bunk and looking for more morsels, and really, we're behind those cattle quite a bit, okay? So I have some examples here. When I pull up and I see too much feed, this would be more than 10% of yesterday's offering left in the bunk. This is what a dusting looks like. This is perfect. This is what we'd like to see every morning. This is not only the slick bunk, but the double slick bunk, because you can see the saliva marks where these cattle have been licking this bunk, and there's no feed to be found. And every time you pull up with a truck, they're chasing you, just hoping that it's their turn to be fed. So what does this mean? Well, when we are trying to read the bunks to determine how much feed to put in the bunk, the rule of thumb is that we don't raise or cut more than 10% of the feed offered from the day before today. So and it's not just across the board for all rations. It is dependent on the type of ration. So if I have a roughage-based ration, like the starter ration, if you remember that graph with the yearlings, I went from 10 to 15 to 19 pounds. Well, roughage-based rations, you can make 5 or 6 pound jumps because there's less chance of having an acidosis episode with that high amount of roughage in there. And you're really just trying to gauge and catch those cattle, and get a gauge of how much they can eat. However, when I get up to a finish ration and they're consuming 20 pounds of dry matter, I'm not going to cut a concentrate-based ration more than 2 pounds per head per day, and probably not more than a pound. So we don't raise or cut more than 10% in a day. We can make bigger or bigger changes, higher or lower, with roughage-based diets than we can with concentrate-based diets. Now, when I pull up and the cattle are slick, remember one thing: barometric pressure and weather changes can drive cattle to the bunk. It's how they have evolved, right? They know the storm is coming. They feel the change. They consume a lot of feed because they're going to go hole up and wait the storm out before they can come out and graze again. So as that barometric pressure might change, those cattle might charge the bunk a little bit harder. So what I'll do, if I come in and I see them slick, I may go up a pound or 2 pounds, but I'm going to leave them there for a couple of days. And I'm going to make those cattle prove to me that this wasn't a weather episode, that this is truly the cattle are hungrier, that they have more intake capacity, and they're going to stay at that level. And then if they stay at that level for a couple of days and they're still slick, I'll go ahead and bump them again. And then I'll hold them there for 2 or 3 days and then bump them a day. Because if I don't, and I come in and I bump them 2 pounds one day, bump them 2 pounds, bump them 2 pounds, and all of a sudden it was a weather episode, you're going to come in and you're going to find a whole bunch of feed in the bunk, and you're going to have to start back over. And you get these cattle cycling on intakes, and it's really hard to catch back up. And sometimes we wind up going back a ration and starting them over and getting them back to finish ration so that we can go on an even plane of feeling. If you have cattle, rather than making a lot of jumps, if you have a hay processing truck, I would have that hay truck driver out in the afternoons looking for opportunities to add a little bit of hay to these animals that are slicking early, so that you can knock the edge off these cattle, but you keep from going into these cycling patterns of up and down nutrition that leads to acidosis and some of the digestive upsets. After you read the bunk, one of the things I'll do as a veterinarian is I'll just follow the feed truck, and at first feeding in the morning. And as we're coming up to the pen, I want to read the cattle. I want a third of the cattle coming to the bunk. I want a third of the cattle standing up, and I want a third of the cattle that are not interested in the feed at all. This means that the cattle are about right. If the feed truck pulls up and they're all at the bunk, I'm behind those cattle. If the feed truck pulls up and nobody's at the bunk, you're way ahead of the cattle. So reading the feed bunk in the morning to figure out how much to offer, reading the cattle as you're putting out first feeding is something that you can kind of gauge to where we're at and how hungry these cattle are and whether we're ahead or behind. And then the last one is to read the feces. And this is about acidosis in the pen. And this is a perfect fecal pat. It's some consistency. You can see some grain, some starch in this, but it has some form, okay? It's still a grain-based fecal pat, but it's not runny like what we get with acidosis. Remember, when we get acidosis, we have water that rushes into the rumen, right? Because water can be a base or an acid. And so if we get a high osmotic pull in that rumen because of acidosis, that water is going to come from the bloodstream. Those calves look dehydrated, their eyes are sunk in, and that water has to go somewhere, and it winds up going out the back end in the form of diarrhea. And so when I start to see this, and I see that gray color that gray color to runny manure, I start to know that we have acidosis. Not only will I see these puddles on the ground, But I'll also see messy back ends, and people say the cattle are painting their butts, meaning that they're having diarrhea that gets on the tail. They swish their tail, and it looks like windshield wiper on the marks on the butts of these cattle. And so gray feces, puddles, this one's got the walking trots, just an indication that, hey, we need to probably put some hay in the ration. Maybe we need to talk a little bit about more when we make ration changes, and how much we're bumping cattle, and how we're managing hay. All of these things are interrelated. When you start out and you start to have acidosis issues or bloat issues, we start out with what ingredients are we feeding? Then we get to, are we mixing them properly? Are we delivering them properly to the bunk at the right time, to the right pins? And then we get to some of the cattle differences and the weather differences, and all these different things are interrelated. But all of this is a system. All of this is dependent on people. People make mistakes. Cattle don't read the book, and weather can be so important. But as far as weather patterns and storm rations, we'll have some people that'll, if they see a storm coming, they'll increase the roughage a point or two, just to take the edge off the cattle a little bit. I'm not one that prescribes to that. I will tell you this, that if we're going to re-implant cattle, there's some work done by Guy Lonergan that shows that if you'll wait and re-implant cattle after they've had their first feeding that day, you'll actually not have decreases in feed intake. But if you take those cattle out of the pen before first feeding, you pretty much lose that day's intake, which can then wind up being a decrease by a quarter of a pound a day across the remainder of the feeding period. So some of those types of things that can save you a few bucks, improve feed efficiency, and improve feed intake. And I'll wind up with this. This is a Blowhard. Those of us that talk a lot understand, but this is used to clean bunks, and cleaning bunks is vitally important, especially with newly received calves and high rainfall and snow events and getting those out. But this is like a snow blower. And we had a feed yard manager in Nebraska that came in one Sunday morning, and he was upset because people hadn't got out and cleaned the bunks yet. It was about 9 o'clock, and he jumped in the tractor and he started this big snow blower or feed blower up. And this thing just goes down and it just blows all the feed and water out of the bunks. And he wrapped that thing up. Well, inside that Blowhard there is a fan with big old thick metal fan blades. And those fan blades started coming loose, and they started shooting out the casing of that Blowhard. And one of them shot through the casing of that Blowhard, out the casing, through the back window of the tractor, and through the front window of the tractor, and missed the feedlot manager. And he hadn't been very nice to people that morning before he got in that tractor. But after that piece of sheet metal missed him, he shut her down, went and apologized to everybody at work, went home, cleaned his underwears out, and went to church. But anyway, I sure appreciate the time. Starting calves on feed is a passion of mine, and if anything I can do for y'all in Mississippi, never hesitate to ask. Thanks for watching Doc Talk. We sure enjoy doing that as well. But we'll have more questions here in a minute.